In this presentation, we'll now talk about landscape ecology. Kind of set the stage for talking about habitat patches as islands in the last presentation on island biogeography. Now we'll look at some of the consequences of viewing habitats patches as islands. So this presentation is divided into two main parts. The first part is about shape, its measurement, and its consequences. And so in that first part, we'll look at just the concept of landscape ecology, which is quite new. We'll talk about the importance of patch shape, which we're going to focus on the size of the patch and area versus its perimeter, and show you some of the interesting problems that arise when you try to understand habitat area versus perimeter. We'll talk about edge effects and their importance, and we'll use one of the most advanced tools for measuring the shape of a patch, which is fractal geometry. This is also quite new. The second part of this presentation will focus on the consequences of having habitats in patches beyond just simple species diversity, which is the focus of island biogeography. So we'll talk about patch structure and movement patterns of organisms in terms of population biology. We'll look at the effect of corridors that connect patches, and we'll look at some landscape architects, as it were, some organisms that behave as we call them ecosystem engineers. They have an outsized impact on species diversity because they shape the landscape around them, providing niches for numerous species. And so fundamentally, they are different kinds of keystone species than a top predator would be. So let's start by just considering the idea of landscape ecology. Once we accept that habitat patches occur as islands and are functionally islands, then it becomes really interesting to ask what the effects are of the spatial pattern of patches and how that pattern affects ecological processes. And we can ask that on the small scale or the large scale, because landscapes may be very, very local, such as a tree or a little patch of trees in the middle of a golf course, or they can be continent-wide, like the distribution of conifer forests in the western United States. So first off, let's just define a landscape as a heterogeneous area consisting of distinctive patches. Okay, and some patches may be entirely embedded in and surrounded by other kinds of patches, which of course would make island biogeography clearly very applicable to our understanding of what's going on in those patches. So landscape ecology could not have existed before we thought of the theory of island biogeography, because landscape ecology is part and parcel the study of movement among isolated habitat patches. And although the islands that we're talking about are habitat islands rather than oceanic islands, and they're not embedded in the ocean, they're embedded in a matrix of different habitat, the principles are exactly the same as we've previously mentioned. So let's just have a look at how difficult it can be to get a handle on landscape structure. So what we've got here is a series of pictures of the forested area in 6 1-square-mile townships. So this is 640 acres each. And what you see is you've got some townships that have very little forest left, like Concord down here at the bottom left, and to a lesser extent Monroe here on the top left, and then other townships that have much more forest, like over here on the right, Washington and Boston. But if I asked you to estimate the area of forest in any of these patches, you'd do a wildly bad job. You'd be all over the place. People are terrible at this task. You can look and look and look at these patches all you want, and your guesses are going to be all over the map. So let's just illustrate that by posing two problems here. First off, let's ask what the proportion of forest is in the top middle graph, this Somerset County, all right, Somerset Township rather. Okay, so look carefully at it and see if you can figure out what the proportion of area that is in forest actually is. By the way, these are agricultural landscapes, so these are little forest patches in a matrix of fields or pastures. So that's the first task. What fraction of this total area is in forest? So keep that in your mind, and then let's move on to a second task, which is to compare two of these patches and to ask whether they have similar areas of forest. So let's compare the top left with the bottom middle. Okay, does one have more forest area than the other? Are they about equal? If one has more area than the other, about how much more? This is appallingly difficult. We need actual tools to do this because people simply can't estimate. So let's look at the answers here. Okay, so here's a histogram that shows us exactly what we've got in the way of answers to those questions. So the Somerset landscape here, this township here, has approximately 22% forest cover. Okay, and when we look at the comparison between Monroe and Hudson, here's Monroe at about 12, and here's Hudson at about 14. These are almost identical, and I'll bet that most of you guessed that this had more, and possibly substantially more. And so it can be very difficult to understand landscapes. We need quantitative tools that help us. Fortunately, modern methods of satellite imagery and geographic information systems are tailor-made to analyze these kinds of patterns. And landscape ecology uses these tools as its main methods of investigation. So let's just ask why patch shape matters. Okay, it's because of edge effects. Edge effect is the suboptimal environmental conditions that you find around the edge of a patch because of its proximity to a different kind of habitat. So it's really easy to understand this when you think about forests surrounded by fields. What's the difference between the interior of a forest and an open field? Well, forest is darker, it's cooler, it's moister. And around the edge of that forest patch, there'll be a gradient from high light, dry, and hot into the low light, cool, and moist inner core of the forest. So some of the area that has trees and looks like forest, in fact, will not be true forest habitat. This is functionally not the same as the inner core. So the edge effect reduces the functional size of patches. Although the core may have these, the patch may have these dimensions, the true forest area is much smaller. So consider one patch that is large and compare it to 4 small patches with identical area. So if you add up the total area here, 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 and here, it's the same area as this. But what does the edge effect do to the functional size of forest in these 4 small patches? Well, the functional size of the forest in the 4 small patches is much smaller than that in the large patch. So size matters and shape matters. Just because you have a large patch does not mean that it's a high quality patch. If it's long and skinny, it could have very, very little core area. And it could be a really lousy habitat despite the fact that it's huge. So shape matters immensely. The area that you get that actually provides niches for interior forest dwelling species is much larger in a large patch than in 4 small patches. And so one of the axioms of conservation biology that comes from landscape ecology is that larger tends to be better. Okay, and we're going to see some of the ways in which larger does tend to be better in a subsequent slide. But not only is larger better because you can support larger populations, you can support more species in a larger patch, but look, you're freer to move around that patch. You don't have a barrier to movement the way you do among the 4 small patches. So there are practical consequences for both patch size and patch shape. Now, here's one of the crazy things that we've discovered since we invented landscape ecology in 1985. And by the way, there is a book dating from 1985 by Monica Turner called Landscape Ecology, and that is the foundation of this field of inquiry. So you might think that the perimeter of an area is a constant, right? No, it's not. It depends on the size of the ruler you are using. So let's take Great Britain for an example. So here we're going to use a 200-mile long ruler. And what we're going to do is connect 200-mile long segments, or 200-kilometer long segments, to give an approximate measurement of the coastline of Britain. Okay, if we do that, then the coastline is about 2,300 kilometers. Well, you might say, well, that's stupid. Okay, so let's use a smaller ruler. Let's use a 100-kilometer ruler. And now you see, we get in the little nooks and crannies a lot better, and we're still missing this one, but it does a much better job. And now we've added 500 kilometers to the length of the coastline of Great Britain. Well, that's crazy. If we use a 50-kilometer ruler, then look, the coastline is 3,500 kilometers because we get into all these little bays much more effectively than with a 100-kilometer ruler. But now my question to you is, what's the right-sized ruler? In theory, the coastline of Britain is infinitely long. If you use an infinitely small ruler, what this suggests is that the length of the coastline of Great Britain will continue to increase as the size of your ruler decreases. This is kind of a nuts idea. Okay, but the scale of measurement that you use determines your understanding of the perimeter of a patch. Now notice the title of this slide says fractal geometry. What do fractals have to do with this? You might know, if you've investigated this at all, that fractals are kind of the self-similar shapes that we use to simulate real shapes in nature. So trying to draw a mountainside using a computer turns out to be really grossly fake looking. But if you use fractals to fill in the shape of the mountainside, you get a much more realistic looking thing. Well, it turns out that fractal geometry helps us understand not the absolute perimeter here, but the rate at which the perimeter changes with the scale of measurement. So that would tell us something about how rough the perimeter is. If you have a totally smooth perimeter, that's say a smooth circle, it wouldn't matter what sized ruler you used. You'd get pretty much the same answer. But if you have a really eroded shape with lots of bays and lots of peninsulas, then it does matter. So the fractal dimension tells you how rough the outline is, and it's really useful when you're trying to understand shape. Here's how we calculate fractal dimension. So look, here we take a series of rulers and we measure the coastline of something here. This is Admiralty Island, okay, and what we're doing here is using a 1 kilometer ruler to measure the length of the perimeter. And what we get is that the coastline is somewhere around, about 800 kilometers. Okay, let's use a larger ruler. Let's use a 3 kilometer ruler. Well, then, as we saw in the previous slide, you'd expect the coastline to decrease in length. And an even larger ruler would cause the coastline to decrease even more. So here's a 10 kilometer ruler, and look, the coastline is only a little over 400 kilometers. All right, but look, it's an approximately straight line. Well, that's a cool relationship, and that's a relationship that we can rely on. If we graph the log of the perimeter against the log length of the ruler, we'll get a straight line. And the slope of that line is what we call the fractal dimension. And it tells us how fast the length of the shoreline, x, increases as the size of the ruler decreases. Okay. If it decreases very steeply, what does that tell us? It tells us that there's lots of irregularities in the edge. If it decreases very little, it tells us that the coastline is pretty regular. So this is a hugely useful thing in understanding the shape of something. And we apply the fractal dimension as a measure of roughness in patches very frequently. Now, let's turn our attention from the shape of a patch and what that means to the consequences of patch shape and distribution. Okay, so let's just stipulate that if you have a lot of fragmented patches with lots of intervening habitat of other types, that will have consequences for movement patterns. And although we're emphasizing animals in these slides, it's true for plants too, because plants have to disperse. It's just that we have some good examples that are easy to relate to when we're talking about animals. So if you have really fragmented habitats with lots of tiny patches, then animals would have to move longer distances in fragmented habitats to go from one suitable set of conditions to another. And here what you see is a mountain range in the Sonoran Desert, and here are some desert bighorn sheep, and the bighorn sheep live in the mountains here, but in order to move from one mountain range to another, they have to cross these desert valleys. So the larger the mountain range, the less moving they have to do. The larger the desert valleys, the more isolated these mountains are, as you know from our previous discussion of island biogeography, and the greater the distance they have to move, and the more difficult it is. So, isolated habitat areas tend to be isolated in terms of their population dynamics too. They are metapopulations, so you can't forget anything in this course, that have relatively low rates of immigration and emigration. Okay, so what is the consequence of that? It means that random genetic drift can really wreak havoc with the genetic diversity and viability of populations that are too isolated, or populations that are too small, or populations that live in patches that have very little core area. So these isolated habitats incur lots of costs of movement and animals don't do it much. That has practical consequences for the conservation of those populations. So here's an experimental analysis of how fragmented landscapes affect animal movements. So here's an experiment by actually someone I know, a friend of mine at the University of Colorado, who mowed patches of prairie into different shapes. Okay, and here you have a large contiguous patch, and there are several of these large contiguous patches. There are some medium patches that are much more fragmented, and here's one and here's another, and then there's some small patches, okay, that are really fragmented. Okay, and each of the dots is a trapping location. And what we're trying to do is ask how mice and rats move in these habitats. So do they move among patches, or do they move within an area, and like one is caught in this trap and then caught in this trap? Is it the same rate as someone who's caught in this trap might be caught in that trap? Or is the movement rate greater here? And what's the proportion of animals that move? If you exhaust some resources locally in this patch, theoretically you can just move like 20 feet and find a fresh set of resources. If you do that in one of these highly fragmented patches, the likelihood is you're going to have to make a movement across an intervening hostile habitat patch. So what are the patterns of movement, and what's the frequency with which these little mammals move? Well, here's the answer. This is patch size here, and you have small patches, medium patches, and large patches. And this is the mean square distance that a single animal would move. And notice that you have 3 species that they're trapping here. In the small patches, only 2 of the species can actually live. These are the smaller ones. Sigmodon is a cotton rat. It's quite large, and it can only live in the medium and large patches. So right there, I mean, this, you can clearly see this corresponds to island biogeography theory. Larger islands have more species. But that's not the question here, really. The question is, how far do they have to move from time to find suitable resources? In the small patches, notice they have to go a long way. They have to cross these bare spots that are of unsuitable habitat. In the medium patches, they have a few more options and they don't have to move as far. In the large patches, they don't have to move very far at all. And that's kind of an obvious outcome of this experiment. What may not be so obvious is who's willing to actually do that. Remember that moving long distances across hostile habitats incurs a cost. You're not getting any food here, you're not getting any water here, you're exposed to predators here. This is not your home. You're taking a risk. You could die. So look at how frequently organisms move. The small patches have very low proportions of movement compared to the large patches. So although these animals in the small patches might be driven to move from one small patch to another, they are reluctant to do it. That means their fitness is suffering in these small patches with easily exhausted resources. It's really easy for individuals in the large patches to move because all they got to do is move a little ways. They're still within their home habitat and they're not taking risks. So many more of them are willing to make the short-term movements that they have to make to remain viable. So this really illustrates the cost of fragmenting habitats into small isolated patches. So landscapes and what they look like and the distribution of patches and their shapes is really important for maintaining viable populations, not just for the number of species that you find in a patch, as we saw with island biogeography. Now, a really cool thing about landscape patches is that some of them are obvious, some of them are not. Here's an example of soil patches that are not even remotely obvious to us. We see some changes in the plant communities, but it's not entirely clear why we're seeing those changes. If we look carefully at the soils that underlie those plant communities, we see what the patches actually are. Here you see creosote bush, which is Laria tridentata, and it's the dominant plant here. And right here, this is a completely different dominant plant, Ambrosia deltoidea. Okay, ragweed, basically. Okay, so this looks completely similar. So why do we see a change from creosote bush to ambrosia? There's no apparent reason. It turns out that the soils are derived from different sources, and those favor different plants. And so just like the paradox of the plankton, where an apparently homogeneous lake actually had a lot of hidden heterogeneity within it, we see a lot of hidden heterogeneity driven by soil dynamics. Now, this course has not emphasized soils all that much. And it's one of the things I regret about this ecology course, but we just don't have the time in one semester to do everything. However, it's really important to understand just how influential soils can be on the plant communities above them and on the animals that live on those plants. Now, habitat corridors can be very important in connecting patches. So let's think about two isolated patches. It's going to be very difficult for animals to move or plants to move from one patch to another. But if they can move through an intervening corridor of habitat that is similar, if not identical, they would have a much higher rate of movement. And here you can see in the landscape of Iowa a forest corridor that follows a river, and it connects forest patches in the near distance and in the far distance. So this patch is connected by this little corridor to that patch. Well, just like in the landscape model of metapopulations, you would expect landscape features to influence movement. Here's kind of a barrier to dispersal between this patch and that one. And you might expect, well, okay, there's not going to be much dispersal, even though they might be kind of close. But in fact, they're actually closer than they look because organisms can disperse through the corridor. Now, this is a really important tool in conservation biology, and we have used habitat corridors quite deliberately in conservation plans for many species. So here are two examples of this. On the left is the corridor, the movement corridor between the Everglades and the swamp forests of Georgia that permit the Florida panther population to remain viable. Basically, Florida panthers can move up and down the entire length of Florida through this habitat corridor. And even though very few panthers could be supported by the Everglades alone, if they can exchange dispersing individuals with other patches, they can maintain a much higher genetic diversity than they would otherwise. Here is a second such corridor, and here is a corridor that goes through the entire country of Costa Rica from the central highlands here through a coastal corridor of rainforest into the Osa Peninsula, which is one of the great primeval forests left in all of North America, north of the Isthmus of Panama. This corridor is crucial for the maintenance of viable populations of Baird's tapirs. These are the largest remaining herbivores in the Central American rainforests that were in existence prior to the arrival of humans. Humans killed all the other ones, the gomphotheres and elephants and such, but the tapirs remain. They are the largest remaining, and their conservation is critically dependent on this habitat corridor. The intervening areas are all farmland, and these are beautiful, beautiful areas of Costa Rica, but they are quite hostile to tapirs. So this corridor is crucial for the maintenance of that population. Other more ambitious corridors have been proposed, and there's one that is just kind of breathtaking in its conception. It occupies the entire mountain chain of western North America from the Arctic Circle all the way into Mexico. This habitat corridor does not currently exist, but it could be connected to ensure the survival of grizzly bears and gray wolves on a continental scale. Currently, there are grizzly bears only in the northern portions of this area, but there's no reason why they could not expand their range back south and reoccupy much of their historic range into central Mexico. Similarly, gray wolves are found mostly in Idaho and Montana, and to some extent in eastern Washington currently, and then all the way north into Canada and Alaska, but not south of there. It is possible for there to be contiguous populations of wolves all the way south and to preserve that top carnivore. Now you might think this is great. Corridors are wonderful, but actually corridors carry risks. Corridors can open pathways to invasion by non-native species. This is a really bad thing. Roadsides, for instance, are often corridors for biological invasions by weeds. This is how many weeds get all over the country. The United States currently has over 5,000 non-native species of plants that have dispersed across North America, and roads have been very influential in their ability to spread across the continent. They damage native ecosystems, they cause the extinction of native species, and the costs of control exceed $100 billion with a B dollars per year at this point. It's only going to get worse. So corridors are a two-edged sword. They can help the conservation of native species, but they also provide opportunities for invasion by non-native species. Okay, finally, let's talk a little bit about animals as landscape engineers. These are keystone species that do not have their effects on communities by regulating competitive exclusion. They actually alter the landscape, providing niches for species that would otherwise be missing. Okay, so on the top left you have elephants. These are the major drivers of savanna succession in East Africa. They are the only animals capable of going into forests, knocking down trees entirely, and opening up opportunities for savanna plants to persist. Were it not for elephants, much of East Africa would be an overgrown forest. And all of those wonderful animal migrations that you see, in the nature shows, like the massive herds of wildebeest in the Serengeti, they would go extinct were it not for elephants. Similarly, alligators build ponds in wetland habitats where there is no open water or standing water, and that provides opportunities for numerous fish species, numerous aquatic plants that would otherwise not have niches at all. So alligators are a keystone species. You remove the alligators, all those open water species go extinct. Not all of these landscape engineers are big and dynamic, though. Kangaroo rats dig little holes at the base of a shrub for a den, and they then defecate and pee in those areas, and they fertilize that plant. So they enrich the soil with nutrients in that area, and they affect the distribution of plants in deserts. Finally, here's another one which I really like. These are termite mounds, and here you see an African antelope standing on a termite mound. Notice that the background is completely flat like a pool table, and here's one of the few elevations in this whole landscape. So the termite mound is providing a topographical diversity that would not otherwise be there. Since termites also bring plant material back to their colonies and digest it, they're also enriching the soil, and that extra organic matter helps to retain water. So there are completely different plant communities on old termite mounds than there are in the surrounding savannas. In North America, we know beavers have had tremendous landscape and ecosystem effects. So this is one of the great ecosystem engineers in North America. Now, here's what you can see happens when beavers move in to an area where they were not really present. So in 1926 here, you have a huge amount of dry forest. And there's a little moist meadow and wet meadow. And then you have a small area of pond. But over the course of 60 years, look what happened to the diversity of habitats. Open water became the dominant habitat. Wet meadows expanded, moist meadows expanded, and the forest retreated. So the beavers are opening opportunities for organisms that rely on niches that are found in open rather than forested habitats. Okay, and not only that, they also alter the nutrient profiles of these habitats. So here, nitrogen decreased, phosphorus decreased, and potassium decreased, but calcium increased, magnesium increased, and iron increased in these landscapes. So these animals are not just producing different mixes of habitats, they're changing the underlying nutrient profiles in those habitats and opening opportunities for new kinds of plants that can tolerate different kinds of nutrient profiles. So, ecosystem engineers alter landscapes. Well, what's the most pervasive ecosystem engineer today? That would be us. And our impacts have generally been to fragment landscapes. And so here you see another township, and this is over time our ability to track the amount of forest in this particular township has revealed that mostly this was forested during the early days of the settlement in the 1800s. By the late 1800s, it was mostly farmland, and now by 1950, there's almost no forest left. Okay, so clearly people have had major impacts on these landscapes, and the habitats that we have established are not necessarily hospitable for any native species because these are all croplands now. So not only are they different niches than the native species are used to, we actively try to remove native species that might want to live in crops because we call them pests. Now you might say, well, this is a one-way ticket to extinction for everybody, and it's hopeless, and people bad. But no, that's not exactly right. Just remember from our discussions of open communities that species can provide substitutable services. So just because we've removed a lot of the species here does not mean that we can't have this landscape recover not only its species diversity, but its ecological functions as well. Here, we see some trends in abandoned agricultural landscapes. All right, now this is the Netherlands. So from 1845 to about 30 years ago, look at how things changed. All right, agricultural land occupied only a small amount of this particular landscape, sand and basically heath. Now, what is heath? It's early stage succession. Okay, and the remaining forest occupied only about 20% of the area. But because this area was not used for a lot of agriculture over time, it was more or less abandoned. And there was some urban building that occurred in the 20th century, but that only took up a small area. The agricultural area remained more or less constant from the early 20th century to today. But look what happened. I mean, this is natural selection. The area of open sand declined. The area of early successional heath, which is not good for much of anything, also declined, and the forest has come back. This gives us lots of hope that although humans are notoriously destructive ecosystem engineers, there's no reason why any destructive trends that we have instituted can't be reversed. Now, it's important to note that the traces of prior modifications don't go away entirely. Species composition and soil properties are permanently altered in these areas. And in fact, you can still to this day detect areas in France that are currently occupied by what looks like virgin forest that were agricultural fields 2,000 years ago during the Roman settlement of Gaul. They differ in species composition and soil fertility from forest areas that were untouched by the Roman settlement 2,000 years ago. So we can recover a lot of things that we change. Some things are going to be permanent.